Okay, great. Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, okay, so just to kind of reset, we're doing the Microsoft Power BI data modeling, data shaping in a day instruction. We've just expanded it out to be in multiple weeks. So we're up to module number 3. We ended with introducing the lab. So we'll first take this. Let me just also introduce the Slack channel. All right, so we're doing all of our communication on the Power BI users group Slack. We have this advanced data modeling class channel. If you go through that at the very beginning, we got the files to download. And Michelle has been posting the links to the previous sessions if you want to go back and listen to me ramble. Let me get a link for it. Sorry, I meant to do this before.
Tina, and anybody else who wants to go back and listen to sessions they missed, you'll want to grab this link and join the Slack group, because that's where you'll find the recordings. If for some reason the link doesn't work for you, please post your email in the WebEx chat or the Zoom chat, and then I will invite you the other way.
Okay, so the Slack, well, thanks, Michelle. That link is out in the chat now, so make sure you join if you haven't. Okay, lab for module 2. Anybody have any questions from when they were working on it? Did you all find it pretty simple? Just the instructions all worked, everything was great?
I have some questions, but I need to find them. I thought it was organized, and I'm not.
Sound like me.
Evan, I have raised my hand, but I don't know if that's a protocol that other people use or that you look at, because I don't want to just jump in on top of anybody.
Oh, go ahead. I'll actually even open that window so I could see if people raised their hand too.
Well, I just didn't know it when it's funny because it takes you, it's good. Obviously it's an exercise to demonstrate things. The funny thing happened, if anyone did, let me just do this by inferring from examples. I don't know if anybody did that. It made me laugh out loud. Did anybody? I don't know if people did it, and if they did, because they want you to go and use these functions like find the comma, then or split on delimiter, and then look for the comma, and then do a text substring basically to pull everything up to the comma and after the comma. And if you do the learn from examples, you get very different. You get a totally different kind of what it learns.
Yes, that happened to me too.
Did you see why? Did you see why?
No, in fact, I think that was one of my questions.
It's hysterical. It's because when they generated this database, everyone that I could tell, everyone's email address is first name dot last name at xyza.com. So it's like you get first name dot last name, left parenthesis, first name dot last name at xyza.com, right parenthesis, colon, space, last name, comma, first name. So each first name and last name is twice in the string. So when it does the learn from examples, it picked the first ones and it just pulled it out of the email address, which I don't know if anyone, I mean, Kevin, I don't know if you've looked at the data or.
No, I didn't try. I'm looking for the instructions. Which one was it?
It was the creating the customer dim. It was the create customer dim, this one.
Okay.
So it walks you through like, okay, do a split by delimiter. Let's see, is there an example of the text string? Because this seems like it's ripe for when the learn from examples, like we talked about last week, is a really handy, slick thing that it does. And then you see, and then the next one, they're saying, okay, now look for the comma, because after the delimiter, you have last name, comma, first name. So you find the text position of the comma. So then that's going to be in its own column. So, I mean, it's a demonstration of things that you can do. And then you use that position number in the top of the next page to as a indexes into the string. So like pull the first part of the string up to the comma, that's part A, or that's the last name. Yeah, because that's before last name, comma, first name. Anyway, but you're not seeing here the example of the actual what they look like, so you can't tell. But
Yeah.
that first name and last name are embedded in the email address. So when you do the learn from examples, it picks them out of the email address. It doesn't look after the colon to pick them out of the. It's kind of a funny thing, like about when you do learn from examples, be careful what you wish for. Like, you don't really know, unless, we talked about this last week, unless you look at it and you see what it's generating. It generates a completely different thing. And it taught me a different Power Query function that I didn't know, which is basically.
So it could be very useful.
Yeah, they have a function
try it
called
a different way.
Yeah, it's what text.
One of the things, like when they developed this, maybe query by examples wasn't there, and they continue to reuse it, right?
Absolutely. And it demonstrates the point. Like, it demonstrates, how do you add a custom column? You know, here's some useful text functions. So I'm not objecting to it as an instructional thing. I thought it was funny. And there's this function called text.between delimiters. So it's like text.between delimiters, the period and the @ sign, the left parenthesis and the period. And it literally, that's where it pulls it out of the email address.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, I said nothing.
That's all right. No, that's good. That's good thought, right? Because, you know, every programming language, there's a ton of different ways to do it. And some you'll like better than others. Some are more efficient than others, right? Some work better than others.
It's partly the language, but it's also the data. So sometimes the data has relationships inside of it that you don't realize when you're just looking at the data file. So the fact that if it's really the case that every email address is first name dot last name, and I don't know if we know that for sure, because I didn't verify, but you have a relationship there that could trip you up if you would.
Or a text pattern more than a relationship, right? So
okay.
I always kind of caution as we get into requirements where people say, well, just parse this out of the text. And the first thing I'll ask is that text free form, or is it like from a drop down, right? Or is that text system generated? Because if it's free formed and typed in by
humans,
by users, it will fail. Yeah. I put that out there right away. I will not guarantee that this will work. You will get whatever happens to work, right? But yeah, I mean, if the company that is generating email addresses, right? You know, like I'm at one company, my email address has part of my middle name in as my first name in order to make it unique, because there is 2 Kevin Arnolds at the company.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's text splitting and text to generate other data is risky. But I think what this is trying to show is it can be done.
Yeah,
right?
and I guess the other point that I think is also from last week, which is super, is when it's automatically putting the code in, it actually does pay to open the advanced editor and look at what it inferred, look at what it figured out, because it may be that the sample of text you learn from has this, everyone's first name dot last name, but you don't want that because you know that's going to break eventually.
Yeah.
And so if you don't look at the code, I mean, that's where I was surprised. That's what really blew it, because I looked at the code and I thought it would do exactly what these instructions did.
Yeah.
And it did something completely different, and it made me laugh. Right.
Yep. Kind of like Mighty Python, now for something completely different. Okay, trying to move on from that joke that didn't land. Anything else before we jump into?
I'm posting some of my questions in the advanced data modeling thread there, so that you can see my questions or my aha moments. And I tried to put, what page the question came from.
Oh, so just picking these 2 columns and merging them?
I didn't know you could do that. I guess I've always only ever merged on one column at a time. And I found that interesting.
Yes, and so make sure when you're doing the merge between the 2 queries, right? You check, you see the numbers there, right? That tells you the order that it's doing it. it's not by the name. Like I could have chosen category to go to segment and segment to go to category if I chose in the wrong order,
Ah, okay.
right? And you see these little numbers. Let me,
Yeah.
right? Sorry, that's blurry, but that's what those little numbers is. This is column 1, the column 1, column 2, the column 2.
So meaning that the names of the columns are less important than the ones and the twos.
Then the order that, right, the order that you said to join it on. Yep.
They're actually completely, they're completely unimportant. Like it does not look at the names as far as I know. It doesn't
Right.
look at the names at all. And Michelle, I totally agree. I didn't know it could do, I mean, it wasn't last night, it was a couple months ago, but I just remember I needed to do it. And I just thought, what, because when you just click it, then it clicks on the next one. It doesn't. I'm like, well, let me try control click. And then it worked. And I was like, oh my God, this is gonna be so great.
And that's an interesting point, right? Because like when you're doing relationships in your data model, you're limited to one column. But in Power Query, on these merges, right, you could join by multiple columns. So it's very important to keep the concepts of what you're doing inside the data model and not different from what you're doing in Power Query / transform data.
Yeah, it is annoying.
Yeah, I've seen that written multiple times over on Twitter and everything else. The IntelliSense for Power Query is decent, but it's not great. Yeah, and you got to watch for that. I get caught up by that all the time, and I think I cuss every single time, and I have to put $1 in the jar. So
Okay. Well, as long as it's not just me. Okay. Then I feel better.
it definitely isn't you. I think you could find a comment like this maybe more frequent than once a week on Twitter, but something like that. It is frustrating. All right, good
Those are my
conversation.
questions because my remaining questions are in lab 3.
Okay, well, good conversation for lab 2. All right, so let's get into our module 3. So we're going to get into a little bit more about transformations and join up operations, talking a lot of it around the fact table. And then quite abruptly, it will change over to jump into a DAX function. So we'll get towards that towards the end of the module here. I say that because it wasn't, when I was going through it and I'm looking at the slides, I'm like, I don't remember it saying we were going to do DAX this time, but okay. All right. It's a little bit too bad I don't think Corey's here, because this is a question that Corey kind of always comes up with and talks about pivoting columns and unpivoting columns and throwing in transpose, right? So it's a way to be able to
Hello, this is John Goodrich, and I want to say thank you for returning my call from yesterday. You called a few minutes ago.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, so Corey's approach to this is try pivot column and different options. If it doesn't work, try unpivot columns with different options to kind of see what you're doing. But this is a slide to try to explain a little bit more of what's going to happen, right? So you could use transpose to go from columns to rows or rows to columns. And the nice thing there is that the column headers aren't going to be lost. Here you're seeing it's moving color in as the first row, and then you can promote that up to the column headers. Oh, I'm sorry, the column headers are lost. I read that differently, sorry. Right, so this is changing this data into going across and going into columns, right? So you could see the A and the 1 become rows underneath red, and if you promoted this up, you'd have multiple columns with the same name, red, so you'd get an error there, but you'd have to consolidate and fix that. It could be useful in data that you have. Pivot columns. So again, we have the same setup, we're highlighting color and choosing to do pivot. And so it's saying here is letter. It turned letter into rows. And then it put the color in the columns, red, blue, and green. And then it put the values and it filled in nulls where there were no values inside those columns. And here it's just taking this same table and it's changing it back to this setup. And so, you know, a lot of times you want to think about, this is very useful like in fact tables, or you get data. I get it a lot from accounting people I've seen, that they're kind of working and they've already pivoted something and then you need to unpivot it because you want to work with rows rather than the columns. I do like Corey's approach of just kind of mess with it and see which way it works. But hopefully this slide will get you to take your first guess sooner. Another big thing for transforming your data is joins. And we've just kind of talked about that just a second ago. But these are the types of joins that are on the merge functionality within Power Query. And these Venn diagrams are extremely helpful on this, right? So to think about a full outer join, you're going to take both tables, you're going to join on whatever join condition that you have, but you're going to include all the rows from both queries. And if you look down, I still got the instructor notes. So it's saying, for example, table A has 50 rows and B has 75 rows. You're going to get at least 75 rows, right? Because you're going to get all the tables from B. That'll be joined together with anything that matches from A. But if there are if some rows in A don't match, you'll get more than 75. So you'll get those as additional rows. Left outer join is probably one of the most common that people use. So you're going to include everything from your left table, even when there's not a match against your right table. So in this case, everything from A, even when there's no match on B, the data from B will be included for whatever matches with your join columns on A. Left anti this was talked about. Honestly, I've never used left anti, but
Kevin, I could tell you, I've only done it not as part of a working system, but like to check if I have any problems. Like, are there any that don't match? Just like literally just interactively, you know what I mean? Like not as part of the final model, but just to check, do any of these things not match?
Yep, and that's where, right? So your left and right anti joins. That's the great example, right? And exactly what you said. That's what they're talking about here. So you might use it as just kind of a temporary query to kind of see if there are rows that didn't match. Because what'll happen is if let's say you have those rows in your fact table, but you don't have a match in your dimension, that's where the blank row shows up. And we should be talking about that in a future module. And you might want that. You might have a reason for that. So or you might not want it. Best practices in true data warehousing is to always have a match. Power BI kind of pushes away from that a little bit by introducing that blank row. So that kind of covers left and right. Anti inner join, right? You only get what's in what's joined together on the two. So you get only things that match. It's a good way to take things out of your data to have like a limiting table or something like that. And then right is just the opposite of left, where you're going to include everything in B and only what joined from A. Okay. If you're familiar with SQL, right, it's the same concepts.
One of the things I guess that you can do in SQL is you can do a join without any conditions that is essentially like all combinations of the left of A with B, which I guess you could affect here if you had a column of like all ones in, is this right? In each table. And then you merged on that column, then everything matches with everything else. And then you end up with, 50 times 75. You end up with this huge data set. And then you probably have some other criteria that are not, you can't specify through the Power Query join type. Like, let's say it's not that they match, but you have two date fields and you want to know, is the date in A less than the date in B? You know what I mean? Like, it's not, you don't want to match them. They're not equal dates, but you just want all the things in A that happened before the corresponding thing in B. And so, but you can do that in Power Query too. I don't know. I'm just saying, like, it is as flexible as SQL. It's good.
Yeah, I think it is. I think in the example that you're kind of bringing up, I would question the technique of doing it, but it's basically known as a Cartesian product, where you're joining the two without any conditions, and you get the Cartesian product of both. And it could cause issues, but if you're generating data, that could be a way of doing it. But yeah, just know what you're doing when you're doing that.
I'm usually trying to avoid all of those Cartesian joins.
Yep, I fully agree. I tend to avoid them too, but Amin likes to push the envelope with everything.
Well, I told you, my files become like unusable. Like, they just, that's what I was saying at the beginning.
Maybe because you have a Cartesian join in there.
Hey, Kevin, our iPhone member had a question for the key transformation slide in the chat notes.
Is it advisable to pivot or unpivot with large data? All right, 190,000 rows times 50 columns. I don't see an issue with it. It could be that if you're trying to do it over on your laptop and you got limited memory on your laptop, your Power Query processes could be paging. But if it's up like in the service or anything like that, it should be able to handle it.
Is there anything about the number of columns that, like you said, that big, I know it depends on what your data are, but like millions of rows is big. How many is big with columns? How big?
Big cannot, I mean, it really can't be defined that way, right? 190,000 rows at 50 columns, right? I would also kind of question what you're getting in that looks like that. And if there's any way that you could get back to what the originating source was for it, kind of always push towards that. But big is really more defined upon, how you want to set up an architecture and what resources are available. Like if the other part that I would try to think about this question is like, if this is a fact table and it's actually defined well as a fact table, and those 50 columns, 45 of them are, fact, like, sales numbers, quantity, stuff like that. The other 5 are keys. There's no reason to pivot it, right? You're just going to do relationships to it, and that would be considered small for what Power BI could handle, because it's going to compress it very well. So I really would need more context to be able to answer this correctly, to say whether it's advisable or good, or if it's big. Those are so much it depends questions.
Related to that, my question is, for large data set, I mean millions, in the millions, when you manipulate the data, do you advise the user to use the Power Query, or better do it in the ETL2 outside of the platform, then hook up the Power BI to do the visualization? Like, you can use the data factory in the Azure to do that, or Power Query, is it powerful enough to deal with those large data sets?
So this is that's still another kind of it depends question. So it's going to depend upon, right? A Power Query could handle going through millions of rows, it may not be able to handle that on your machine, right? And there's techniques. I think I even worked with Michelle showing her this. I do this on all my models, to where just to build out the model, I might only bring in 10 or 100 rows and filter it from the source, and then build out my model and then publish it up to the service and see how it performs up there, because that's going to be on a server. And it's going to have better performance than any laptop that I could get. Now, to kind of push back a little bit differently, the mantra, and this comes from Matthew Roach from Microsoft, known as SQL Father out on Twitter. He'll say this all the time: as far upstream as possible, as far downstream as necessary, right? So if you have an ETL process already in place, you have access to that, and you could do it up there, right? You're going to have much better results, because that's typically going to run on a much bigger machine. And it's going to help you as you get down into your Power Query or Power BI models, especially if you're going to share that data across multiple models, right? So that's just a good data warehouse type architecture. If you don't have that, you could look at using data flows and put the transformations into data flows up on the Power BI service. And again, you're moving the heavy load processing off of your machine to the service, right? Which is going to have more cores, more memory, right? And architect it better to do all of that. Then you just pull from that data flow into your Power BI data set. But then if you have no other choice, right? If you're limited within your organization and you have to get a report out and you got no choice but to do it inside Power Query, you're into that as far downstream as necessary, right? If not everybody that gets into Power BI has all the IT access that some of the others of us do, right? That can do all of that type of stuff. So, or you have to work with your IT group to put something like that in. So I'd stick by that mantra: as far upstream as possible, because you'll always get the better performance further upstream, but as downstream as necessary. I sometimes do it even though I have access in most of my clients to stand up almost anything. When I'm doing proof of concepts, things just very first time, I'll do it all in Power Query just to start getting access to the data and explore it. So then that helps me line out what I want my ETL developers to do, and I can give them better specs and then build it into a true Azure Data Factory or some other type of ETL process.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Yep, sure. Okay, so other ways of combining data. So we talked about merge, and merge can use multiple columns, or in this case multiple columns. I guess it's the snake method. Append.
Thank you.
Was that a good one?
I appreciate that.
Fool's Day. I'm trying to lighten it up a little bit, right?
You're laughing. It's just we're all on mute.
Yeah, I know. But it's interesting, right? Because they got it spelled this way here, the correct way here, and then incorrectly again here. So append. So append is going to, I like this word. It's going to stack records from 2 or more queries together. Anything that is not matching in the queries, right? Columns that don't match, it's going to add those extra columns, right? So if you have 5 columns in query 1 and 6 columns in query 2, you'll come out with 6 columns, and whatever joined correctly, or I'm sorry, because it's not doing join. So whatever came from query 1, it'll have the 6 columns, but it'll have nulls in that 6th column. It'll be just empty.
Do they have to match they have to match on name and type, right?
Yes.
But they don't have to be in the same order, or do they have to? I don't remember.
I don't think they have to be in the same order. I
Okay,
think
but name
as
and
long
type.
as the names match, then it's going to append those together.
And I
And the-
noticed that when I did an append, they have to be identical. Mine was sneaky and someone had put a space after a column name, and that was just a brand new column to PowerPoint.
I think Kevin agreed that's a terminable offense. That is not acceptable.
It's a resume updating event.
Yeah, there you go.
Somebody from Microsoft had that a couple weeks ago with the AD issue again, the second AD issue in a year and a half, 2 years, something like that.
You mean they caused a major outage because they left a space after a column name, or a space, an invisible space?
I think so. And then that got deployed to Azure AD and everything went down. Didn't seem to be as bad as a couple years ago where it brought everything down. It was awful. But anyways, so then these two on the bottom are ways to produce new queries, right? So it's interesting they talk about this from combining queries. And in a way, kind of reference is combining a query, right? Because you're going to reference query 1 to produce query 2, and it becomes a link in the chain. So anytime you make a change to query 1, it's going to affect query 2. And so I would agree that that's a way to combine data. Where duplicate, it's going to produce a copy of the query at that point in time. And then when you change the original query, or you change the second query, it's not going to do anything to the other query. They're both independent queries at that time. It's just like going into advanced editor mode, doing a control A for all, copy and paste into a whole new query.
Kevin, you showed us the query dependencies view, I think, at one point. I don't know if these slides were made before that was part of Power Query, but that's a really, really useful way to see how these things combine.
Yeah, I in fact, I just used that the other day because when I keep refactoring stuff and change it, my development technique is a little bit, I do it so that I could always get back to a certain point, but then I got to figure out what I got to delete. So I have to try to remind myself what's being used and what's not. And that dependency view is very helpful. When we get into the demo here in a little bit, I can bring that up again and we'll see what it looks like. Okay, so fuzzy merge. There's a couple links down here. I'll copy them and put them into the chat. There's a YouTube video and the documentation on it. But it's a merge. If you're trying to do a merge and you're using text columns that don't exactly match, you could tell it to use the fuzzy matching to perform the matching, and then it because remember, like one thing is Power Query is case sensitive even at the data, right? So this may help you with data when it's case when it doesn't have all the same casing going on, right? So I'm trying to think what they're showing here because everything here looks like it's going to match. I liked let me bring this over. What's in the documentation to me looks a little bit better, right? Because it's gonna, you have these additional options to ignore case, ignore spaces. There's no spaces up there, but when you got Bill here, it's all uppercase, but you got Bill here. Oh, here's an interesting question, and I didn't test this out, but Bill could match on this one depending on, let's see, so 3 out of the 4. Well, Zoe doesn't have anything.
That similarity threshold, I've never typed anything in that box. Like, I don't know. I mean, and I guess I've only barely used this. I don't think I really do, but I don't know how it understands that box, you know?
Yeah, so what it's probably going to look at is it's going to produce a threshold on the match, right? Just based upon whatever black box algorithm it has. And think of it in a percentage, right? And so 100% means it's going to have to fully match, to where you could back it down to 70%, and then you would get more matches, but they may or may not be what you want. That could be the case for this bill I, right? If you back it off, you might get that this matches bill up in this table. It'd be a nice
So it's-
little thing to set up and demo and just kind of mess with to see.
Okay, so it is a kind of like trial and error. Like you put in a number, like you're not getting enough matches, so then you put in a number and you tweak it up or down to see so you're happy.
Yeah. You know, or you may set it to be, you know, like 100, and you're ignoring case so that it still matches bill and bill, but it doesn't match this. Right, could be another use case for that.
Sure.
Is this it takes a percentage value, or it just takes a number?
It would be a number, but I tend to think of it like a percentage. It's a good question. I haven't looked to see if it takes it as a fractional number. Most of the time, these thresholds are usually built behind the scenes. When you see it, it's built as a fraction between 0 and 1. But then sometimes they turn them into a whole number, right, and make it from 0 to 100.
Yeah,
I'd have to look at deeper in the documentation to tell you exactly what that would have to be.
I used a similar function in another kind of like a data transformation tool. They specify, hey, it's a like a 1 to 100%. It tells you need to enter a percentage there.
Yeah, I'm sure we could find better documentation, or this YouTube video, which I haven't gone to watch, is probably going to tell you one way or another. But yeah, that what you're talking about is very similar to tools, and I've seen some do it in whole numbers. I've seen some do it in fractional numbers. So probably whole numbers now is more the standard way. The industry keeps getting to be more and more standard. Okay. Another extremely useful tool, if you haven't used this yet, is your data profiling, right? It helps you easily understand what's going on with your data. And when you click on a column, you could get the extra column distribution information down below. You'll get these column statistics. One of the things that I think we talked about once or twice with this group is there's a, oh, somebody put in some more information on the chat. It goes from 0.0 to 1.0. So, and the default is 0.8. So in the chat, you could, thanks, Ahmed, for putting that in there. So this uses fractional values. Okay, so you could turn those on in the view ribbon, right? And hit your check boxes to what you want to see as information across your data. And it's very, very useful when you're profiling or you're first getting to learn your data. Okay, so now into our abrupt subject change of DAX. So
I love it. I love it.
I know it was so random, right? We're talking all this other stuff, and then all of a sudden we jump into a DAX statement, and what they're using this in is to do a calculated column and use the related function. So it's going to convert into row context, and it's going to do related. And what related is similar to like a VLOOKUP, right? So it's going to do a lookup in the other table. This looks like this is sales, right? So they're adding sales calculate it. And it's going to be against the product dim. Here's the product, and the unit price times the units. So when this column gets added, it's going to take units from this, and it knows how to get over to product by this product column. And that's what related is saying is how the relationship is defined in the model from the sales table to the product table is how it knows how to get across to it.
Can we, when we do the demo, can you talk a little bit about what row context is and what the alternative is? Because that's where I get, you know, it's speaking of context, like we don't have any, right? It's an abrupt context shift. But
yeah, so the other context is filter context. And I think we'll get into that a little bit more in a future module, right? But basically, like if you think about calculate, and what's happening here is you have a row context because this is being executed row by row on this table. And so this DAX is automatically into the row context, and it would be similar to putting in here, the other context is called a filter context, and it converts this row into filtering for this table. And so the only thing it can filter on is this product ID. So it filters this product table by the row that you're going on.
Are we going to demo this? Because I have another question.
There's a slight demo for related. So I'll get into that here in just a second.
Okay.
But thanks. iPhone did remind me, and I did wanted to bring this up when we were looking at the data profiling. When you're doing this is only going to be based upon your first 1,000 rows, and Power Query is doing that to limit the resources on your machine. Down at the very bottom of your page, it's telling you that, and if you click on those words that say based on 1,000 rows, you could change the option to say based on entire table. And remember just how big your table is, and it's the resources on your laptop or machine, whatever you're using, that it's going to try to take all those up. And then it will look at it for the entire table. So that is changeable, but by default, it starts out with the first 1,000 rows. Okay, so this is kind of talking, this is another example of related, to where from sales, right, because we're starting on sales again, we're going to produce a column that is the concatenation of city and state. And this is what this is trying to show is related will navigate through all of the relationships to try to find its path to the item that you're putting in here. So here it's getting to the geography dim through the customer dim. So even though sales doesn't directly relate to it, there is a relationship path through customer to get there.
And this is, I remember there was something where if you have a second relationship that's not the active one, that's inactive, there was another way to tell it to use the inactive relationship. Was that?
Yeah, that's the use relationship function.
Right, right.
And that has to be used within calculate. So you'd have to change this to calculate. Okay, so this does want me to do a demo now. So hopefully I could do that. We're running up against the wall, which is fine because I think there's only a couple slides. Yeah, there's only like 2 more slides after this. So let me bring this over, and then as always in my just-in-time approach, I will go through and look at what they want me to do in the demo. I did actually read it earlier. I just got a bunch of stuff over top of it. Oh, that's not the right window. Get rid of some of these windows and I might be able to find what I'm looking for. make things so hard on myself sometimes. Okay. So even though it says we're going to do demo 3 related function, it's actually demo 4. If you're updating your scorecard at home. So we'll go into transform, show it on the correct window. And we're going to go into the sales table. And we're going to add a column in here. Oh, I'm sorry, we're actually not doing this in transform. I forgot. We moved back to Power BI and DAX. Go into the sales table. They already produced sales COGS. And you see they have in here sales COGS related, where it's going to get over onto the product table. And it's going to use this ID to filter the product table. And so that is going to, because since we know this is a unique key, it's going to filter down to one row. So that's what they mean by row context, because this is running within each row of this sales table. It could do row context for the filtering of the product table.
Is this a column, not a where do I see that this is a column and not a measure? Where do I look? To
because I'm in I'm in this view, the data view, and I added it as an actual column here.
So I would see, but I mean, I could add a measure in this view too, right? So it would look, is it just the icon that shows it's different? How do I know?
Well, if I show it as if I do it as a measure, which I could, right? But where I'm going to end up doing it is, let's see, if I do.
Oh, it says at the top in the ribbon, it says measure tools instead of column tools.
Yeah.
That's one thing.
Yeah.
That was a hint. Is it the case that for this related function, it shows up more in columns than measures? It feels intuitively like an add column thing, not an add measure thing, but I don't know why.
It shows more, I would say, in adding as a column. You could use it within a measure, but you would end up having to be making sure that you're going row by row in here, because you need to have only one. Let's say, for example, that I want to do COGS here, right? I'll call it COGS measure. What I could say is, because I'm only going to return one value, so I'm going to do a sum X. And I am going to use the sales table. So now I'm iterating through sales, okay? Similar to how during refresh time, it would be iterating through sales. And what I want to sum together is going to be related product and unit. So product unit cost times sales what is it, units? Yeah.
You have to, even though you're in the sales table, or maybe you're going to move this measure, do you have to say?
It's a good practice. The best practice is to reference columns prefixed by the table and only reference measures without the prefix.
Okay.
I forgot to close my parentheses here. So my parentheses should close here. My parentheses on my sum is going to close there. And in that case, I have a similar setup, but in this case, I'm summing it, right? To where if I did it as this calculated column, I could sum this, I could average it, I could do whatever with it, right? But as a measure, I've already pre-decided I'm going to do the sum of it.
Do you have to do the related function because you're kind of telling it, hey, I know this column isn't native to the columns I'm in or the table I'm in, but I need you to use it anyhow?
Correct. And there is ways that you could end up with just using the column without the related function. I was trying to show the exact same setup, right? I would probably even try this without it to see what happens. I just don't think we have the time here right now. Since we're up against it. But this is how I would write that as a measure rather than taking up storage space, which is another option, unless you really want to take up the storage for this for other reasons. So you got to think about, do I want to increase memory or increase CPU time at execution time? And
Okay.
Taking up memory can make your model big, right? Having your model small and having the measure go through it, it's going to run at execution time, could be faster.
How does the related function recognizes to query the other table by product ID and not customer ID?
Because of the, yeah, good question. Because of the relationship that's set up here. Let me see if I could make it big enough that we could see it now that I see where it's at. Oops. Right? Because for sales, there's a many-to-one relationship to product, and it's defined by product ID.
Okay.
That's how it knows, is through the model that you put together. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's kind of bust through these. This one is kind of important. And this is, when you're just producing a report and you're taking a column and dragging it on, and it is a number column, right? Power BI is going to let you create what's called an implicit measure, right? And usually a measure will have a default summarization option, right? You could change it in your model, or you could even bring it on to the visualization and change it at the visualization. But the best practice is not to use implicit measures, but to define your measure, right? Because this way you have control over it, and you would end up being able to reuse it. Again, I only use it like when I'm quickly exploring it. I don't plan on saving it, but for a good user experience, it's highly recommended you do explicit measures like what we just did, right? Producing the sum of cogs. And because cogs was a calculated column, I could have just done sum of cogs and I'd get the same answer. But on either one, it's good to do explicit measures. So because of sake of time, I'm gonna kind of just skip over this one a whole lot. I don't know if a lot of you guys use quick measures, right? But you could go out there on the quick measure and you could just pull in the values, right? It's got boxes here that you could just pull in and verify, and then it's going to generate the DAX for you. This right here is probably the best thing about quick measures. It's a good way to learn DAX. And they built in some error handling and a couple other things, which is really kind of interesting. A lot of times we don't build error handling like this into it. We just return blanks by the measure. But like I said, it's a great way to help you learn DAX by kind of like similar to what Amin was talking about. When you do something in Power Query and it's going to generate the M for you, read it. Here, same thing. It'll generate the DAX, read it and understand it, but then go and look to see some of the best practice, the better ways of doing it. And I'm going to skip the demo on it because we are right up against time. Okay, so your assignment between now and next week is to do lab 3, which you're going to add the budget fact table into your model. So the instructions will be in what you've already downloaded, and you should be able to go from there. Any quick last second questions? I think it was a very good session. We had a lot of good questions this time.
If we have questions while we're working on the labs, what's the best channel in Slack to post them?
The modeling question, the class one.
Okay.
If you put it there, pretty much I'm going to see it on any one of them, but just feel free. So since it's related to this modeling class, I would put it in the advanced data modeling class. If
Okay.
it's something that you're trying to do that you're just needing help with, that's outside of this modeling class, then I would put it in the general.
Okay, so if you're doing a lab question and putting it in the modeling class, maybe just make a note. This is, I'm working on lab 3. This came from page whatever, so we can all get back to it faster.
Yeah. Yeah, and eventually, right? I mean, hopefully I'll either get to it pretty quickly, or I saw the other day somebody put something out in general, and a lot of people jumped on it and helped them out. So that was great. And then by the time I got to look at it, it's like the problem looked to be solved. And some people put some very good complex stacks out there to help this person along. So it's good to see our Slack channel getting used that way and people helping each other out.
That's great. I'm going to stop the recording.